AP 120, Chapter 16, Topics, Anatomy of the Respiratory System. So the respiratory system has quite a few very important functions. For instance, it filters, warms, and moistens incoming air. So the air is a little harsh, and when we breathe it in through our nose, we're able to warm it, filter particulates, and moisten it so that it is proper for the delicate structures in the lungs. Then we transport the air to the alveoli, the delicate structures in the lungs where gas exchange will occur, allowing oxygen to enter the bloodstream and carbon dioxide to leave the bloodstream. The respiratory system also allows us to produce sound, very important, especially for speech. The respiratory system also is how we engage in olfaction, or the sense of smell. And finally, the respiratory system helps to regulate our blood's pH. So how fast or slow we breathe can affect the pH of our blood. So respiration is the entire process of having gases move in and out of the body, so going from the atmosphere to the individual body cells all throughout our body. Now, the movement of gas specifically from the atmosphere to inside the lungs and out again is ventilation. So breathing in and out, that is ventilation. External respiration occurs when there's gas exchange from the air in the lungs, found in the alveoli, with the bloodstream, with the blood capillaries surrounding the alveoli. So oxygen entering the bloodstream, carbon dioxide leaving, that is external respiration. Then, of course, the oxygen is transported throughout the body, taken to our tissues. And then internal respiration is the movement of oxygen out of the bloodstream and into our tissues to get into our individual cells, and the movement of carbon dioxide from the individual cells into the bloodstream. So internal respiration occurs all throughout our body. And then finally, there is cellular respiration, where oxygen is utilized to produce ATP, and carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product of the production of ATP. All right, structurally, we can break the respiratory system down into an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. Basically, the upper respiratory tract are structures you can potentially see or sort of touch. So the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses found in the cranial bones, and the pharynx or throat. So they're all in the head. The lower respiratory tract includes the larynx, the trachea, the bronchial tree found inside of the lungs, and of course the lungs themselves. The nose is supported by bone and cartilage, and it is the entranceway for air. And as air enters, it starts to be filtered by the coarse hairs found in the nostrils. Obviously, air can also exit the nose. There is a wall, a nasal septum, that divides the nasal cavity into a right side and a left side. And on the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, you find three structures pushing into the space of the nasal cavity. These are the nasal conchae. They are lined with a mucous membrane. They help to break up the space of the nasal cavity, causing air to have to swirl within the nasal cavity. This then allows for increased warming of the air, moisturizing or adding water to the air, and of course filtering the air by having the mucus of the mucous membrane binding to particulates. The mucus is of course produced by some of the cells, the goblet cells in the epithelial tissue lining the nasal cavity, and then that tissue also has cilia. The cilia will beat, and as it beats, it'll move the mucus from the nasal cavity to the pharynx, and then the mucus can be swallowed or spit out. But if it is swallowed, then the gastric juices can destroy any microorganisms trapped by the mucus. We also have these spaces, the paranasal sinuses found in some of the bones of the skull, the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the sphenoidal bone, and the maxillary bone. So those bones house the nasal sinuses, which are connected to the nasal cavity and are also lined with mucous membrane. Functions of the paranasal sinuses include reducing the overall weight of the skull and also providing resonance chambers to make the timbre of the voice more rich. Oral cavity. Oral cavity is not part of the respiratory system. However, we all know we can breathe in or out through our mouth. Pharynx. Pharynx is the throat. It is the common passageway for both air and food, air going to course to the larynx, food going to the esophagus. You can break the pharynx into three regions: the nasopharynx coming directly after the nasal cavity, the oral pharynx coming directly after the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, which is directly above the larynx and the esophagus. The larynx itself is a very important structure in the respiratory system. Besides connecting the pharynx, the throat, with the trachea, it also houses the vocal cords, which allow us to produce sound and even speech. Another important function of the larynx is to prevent food and drink from entering the trachea. So the larynx blocks the entrance of food and drink from the lower respiratory tract. So using directional terms, the trachea is what to the larynx? I hope you said inferior. The trachea is inferior to the larynx. The larynx is composed primarily of muscle and cartilage, although the hyoid bone is sometimes considered the superior structure of the larynx. The larynx is either attached to the hyoid bone or includes the hyoid bone. It has the thyroid cartilage that sticks out anteriorly. It's the big bump that you can see especially large in men. And then below that is the cricoid cartilage, which is the inferior portion of the larynx that then connects to the trachea. And they are made of hyaline cartilage. Then there's also this mobile leaflet of cartilage called the epiglottis. Epiglottis is composed of elastic cartilage, and when we swallow, the epiglottis folds over and covers the opening into the larynx. So proper functional epiglottis will prevent food and drink from entering the larynx by covering the top of it when we swallow. Here is a camera view down into the larynx. So here's the epiglottis, and we can see way down there's the trachea, and there are two folds of muscular and connective tissue, the false vocal cords and the inferior true vocal cords. The false vocal cords are able to close or open the space of the larynx, so it can prevent sound from being produced, can prevent air from passing through the larynx. The inferior true vocal cords are able to vibrate as air passes them, and those vibrations are what produces sound. Now we're able to control that sound produced by changing the tension on the true vocal cords. So there are muscles that can contract, tightening the vocal cords, allowing for a higher pitch, or relax and lower, deeper pitch. And then, of course, if you want to affect volume, you just increase the amount of air going past the true vocal cords, basically hitting them, causing them to vibrate more vigorously. Inferior to the larynx is the trachea. The trachea connects the larynx down to the bronchial main bronchi. It enters the thoracic cavity, then splits into the right and left main bronchi. The trachea has 20 incomplete cartilaginous rings. So as you can see down here, they're more of a horseshoe-shaped piece of cartilage. These are important because they keep the trachea open. So the trachea is always open, always has air within it. Posterior to the trachea is the fleshy esophagus, which is normally closed, normally does not have air in it. The trachea is lined with ciliated mucous membrane. The epithelial tissue, of course, has goblet cells that produce mucus. Mucus traps particulates and then moves upward toward the larynx so that the mucus containing those particulates can be either swallowed or spit out. So similar to the nasal cavity, just in the moves the mucus in the opposite direction. Tracheotomy is when a hole is formed through the trachea to avoid some sort of obstruction higher up, and thereby allowing the person to continue to have air flowing into and out of their lungs. Bronchial tree is also a mucous membrane structure made up of many tubes that branch and become smaller and smaller and smaller until they eventually reach the alveoli. Bronchial tree also, because it's lined with mucous membrane, helps to warm, moisten, and filter air. And the cilia in most of the bronchial tree helps to move the mucus up to the trachea, then up toward the larynx. So the trachea splits into the right and left main bronchi. The main bronchi then split into the lobar bronchi, and the lobar bronchi then split into the segmental bronchi, which then split into smaller and smaller structures. So the main bronchi are the first structure to enter the lungs, carrying air into the lungs, and then they split into lobar bronchi, one per lobe, that then split into various segmental bronchi. The segmental bronchi split many times until they become the microscopic bronchioles, eventually leading to the terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are the last structures that only carry air. They then turn into the respiratory bronchioles that lead to the alveolar ducts that lead to the alveoli. And the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveolar sacs composed of alveoli, all those structures are able to allow for gas exchange. So terminal bronchioles are the last structures that only carry air. After that, you get gas exchange. And here's just a breakdown of the breaking down of the bronchial tree. Main bronchi, lobar, segmental, continuing to branch until you get many tiny bronchioles, microscopic bronchioles that become terminal bronchioles, that then become the respiratory bronchioles that split into the alveolar ducts, that then become the alveolar sacs composed of alveoli. Gas exchange is, of course, an important function where the thin squamous cells of the alveoli are next to the thin squamous cells of blood capillaries, allowing oxygen to enter the bloodstream and carbon dioxide to leave. And of course, this is external respiration. Lungs. Each lung is surrounded by its own pleural membrane, which is a serous membrane with a visceral layer lying on the surface of the lung and a parietal layer on the outside, and a thin amount of fluid that helps to lubricate the lung so that as the lung expands and shrinks, the friction it experiences rubbing up against the thoracic cage is reduced, so the lungs are not damaged by that friction. Lungs are spongy tissue, sort of cone-shaped. They're separated by the mediastinum, and inferior to them is, of course, the diaphragm. The right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, inferior. The left lung has 2 lobes, superior, inferior. The left lung also has a little divot called the cardiac notch, which basically is making room for the larger left side of the heart. Each lobe contains air passages, alveoli, nerves, blood vessels, etc., all the things you expect in living organs. And that is it for this part of Chapter 16.